It was a dazzling showpiece, really. This is Henry VIII making a great statement about how magnificent his new palace is.
Hampton Court almost immediately became a bustling, busy palace. And it really is, and was, Henry VIII Wonderland. It's Henry VIII's Disneyland, because everything is about Henry VIII there. It's a big palace all about him. And within 6 months, major rebuilding of Hampton Court had started, essentially because Henry VIII had this gigantic court. So one of the first things Henry did was to start expanding the kitchens, because those 1,000 people in his court have to be fed.
Henry's kitchens were the largest in England and employed 200 cooks who had to produce over 800 meals every day. For more than 200 years, different kings and queens dined on food prepared in here, right up until 1737. Still in working condition today, the 36,000 square foot kitchens are managed by Richard Fitch.
You can see these arched entrances, 2 on this side, 1 on the other side of the building, and then 3 further fireplaces as we would move down through towards the end. Each one of the large fireplaces has the capacity to roast enough meat for 400 people in, so it gives you an indication of this excess capacity that's built into the space for working. And if we look right the way up to the top, it's about 11 metres all the way up to the apex of the roof. It's part of the air conditioning to try and move the heat from this ground level where it would be really unpleasant to work and try and shift it out through the roof out into the rest of the world.
1.3 million logs per year would have been used in the kitchen's ovens. The fires here would have been burning almost constantly to cook for the 1,000 courtiers who worked for the king.
So the king at the top gets 2 14-dish courses per meal. The people right at the very bottom get 1 course that contains 2 selections of beef, some bread and some beer. But it's still more than normal people in the rest of the Tudor world would be getting. The whole point of the meal isn't sustenance, it's to show the power of the monarch and the value that he puts on his staff.
This was a busy, hard-drinking, hard-eating, hard-working palace. And if you were a Tudor of influence and power, that's where you wanted to be. You wanted to be at Hampton Court.
Work continued throughout the palace as Henry turned Hampton Court into one of the most magnificent royal residences in Europe. But by 1536, it became clear that Queen Anne Boleyn would not live to see the renovations.
Even before Henry had married Anne Boleyn, he started rebuilding the apartments here for her so that they would be ready for when she was his wife and she could live in splendor. Well, in fact, poor old Anne didn't quite live to see their completion. She's known as Anne of 1,000 days. She was queen for less than 3 years. And then she went to the block, the first of Henry's wives to be executed.
Found guilty of adultery, incest and treason, Anne was beheaded at the Tower of London on the 19th of May, 1536. But her memory lives on at Hampton Court.
One of the things I love most about the Great Hall is that you see the personalities come through. It's not just about the grand architecture and the great events. And probably my favourite feature in the whole of the Great Hall is something you could easily miss. It's in that central panel there. In the top right-hand corner, you might just make out an intertwined H and A. Now that stands for Henry VIII, and Anne Boleyn, his second wife. That shouldn't be there at all, because Henry always decorated his palaces to reflect the latest wife, but once she'd gone, her initials were replaced with the new wife. But obviously, his overworked carpenters managed to miss one.
The day after the execution of Anne Boleyn, Henry married for a 3rd time, but the new Queen's apartments remained incomplete.
So he does start the new apartments for Anne Boleyn, but it takes such a while to complete them. By the time they are finished, she's lost her head, and they are taken over by his next queen, Jane Seymour, and this is where Edward VI is born.
Henry had been desperate for a male heir since his first marriage in 1509, and now, 28 years later, his dynasty was finally secured.
You might imagine Henry VIII rides over here when he hears the news. He is transported with joy. At last he has a son. But that joy soon turns to grief because Jane Seymour has contracted an infection after the birth, and she dies just a few days later.
Henry was devastated. The woman who had finally bestowed a son upon him was gone. The grieving king became increasingly paranoid and wary of those around him.
A rather hidden feature of the Great Hall, you really have to look carefully for them, are up in the ceiling. Tiny little faces peering down at us from the eaves, and they are eavesdroppers. That's where the word comes from. These little faces were to remind the courtiers sitting below that everything they said was heard by the king.